Okay, so we all think we know the story of the US Constitution, right? Written in 1787, a brand new idea for a brand new nation. But what if I told you that its blueprint wasn't entirely new? What if a super sophisticated constitution had already existed on the American continent for centuries? And the founding fathers, well, they were taking notes.
Yeah, that's the real question, isn't it? Because when you start to peel back the layers of American history, you find an origin story that is way more complex and, frankly, a whole lot more interesting than the one we're usually told in school.
And that story, it begins right here. Now, this isn't just a beautiful artifact. This is the Hiawatha Belt, and it represents the Great Law of Peace, the actual constitution of the Iroquois Confederacy. It existed long before 1776, establishing a form of democracy that would totally capture the imagination of men like Benjamin Franklin.
So to really get a handle on its influence, we gotta go back, way back, to its epic origin. This wasn't just some document. It was a landmark peace treaty that brought an end to generations of war.
Okay, so picture this. It's sometime in the 15th century. A man known as the Great Peacemaker has this powerful vision to unite all the warring Iroquois nations. He travels east and meets Hiawatha, a man just broken by loss. And together, they forge this incredible alliance, nation by nation. Their final obstacle was this tyrannical chief, Atarho. But in a legendary act of peace, they convinced him to join, forming the League of Five Nations and establishing the Great Law. Just an amazing story.
And this Great Law of Peace, or Gayaneshigawa, was a real deal, fully formed constitution. I mean, it laid out a system of federalism with checks and balances, separation of powers. It even guaranteed personal freedoms and held leaders accountable to the people. For its time, these ideas were absolutely radical, anywhere in the world. And its core purpose was just so profound. The Great Peacemaker declared that they would literally cast all weapons of strife into the earth and plant a tree of peace. So you see, this wasn't just some political document. It was a sacred promise to end war forever. But, and this is a huge but, right at the very heart of this democracy was something that would have been absolutely mind-blowingly shocking to European colonists: the central role of women. You see, unlike European society, which was all patriarchal, Iroquois society was matrilineal. And this meant everything: your clan identity, your name, your property, and political power itself. It was all passed down through the mother's line. And the scope of this power was just immense. The clan mothers, the female elders, they held the real authority. They were the ones who selected the male chiefs, and they could remove them from office if they messed up. They owned the land. They had veto power over acts of war. In this society, they were the ultimate authority, period. And hey, don't just take my word for it. This isn't some modern reinterpretation. A French missionary living among them back in 1724 wrote that the women possess all actual authority and were the arbiters of peace and war. It was just obvious to any outsider who was really running the show. So as European colonists start spreading out across the continent, they come into direct contact with this powerful confederacy. And, some of the most influential figures in American history, well, they started paying very, very close attention. The colonists arrived with all their own prejudices, right? They were expecting to find lawless savages. But what they discovered instead was a sophisticated, highly organized society that valued individual liberty and political equality in ways that were, in many respects, miles ahead of what they knew back in Europe. And this quote from Benjamin Franklin just captures that astonishment perfectly. He's writing this in 1751, and he's basically saying, how on earth can 6 nations of ignorant savages pull off such a perfect union, while we English colonies can't even get our act together? He saw their confederacy as a model, plain and simple.
And yet, despite all this clear influence, it took over 200 years. Can you believe that? It wasn't until 1988 that the U.S. Congress finally passed a resolution formally acknowledging the Iroquois Confederacy's contribution to the U.S. Constitution.
And this relationship wasn't just some vague idea. It was formal and direct. Just look at this. This is the George Washington Belt from a treaty in 1794. Notice the figures on the belt. They represent the 13 colonies, hand in hand with the people of the Iroquois Longhouse. This was a covenant between 2 sovereign powers. But this is where the story takes a really crucial turn.
Because while the Founding Fathers borrowed a ton from the Iroquois political structure, they made a massive, deliberate choice to leave a core part of its philosophy behind.
So to really get what they rejected, you first need to understand the legal status of colonial women. Under English common law, a doctrine called coverture applied. A married woman was a femme couverte, a veiled woman. Her legal identity was completely absorbed or covered by her husband's. She was, for all intents and purposes, civilly dead. I mean, just look at these two worlds side by side. On the left, you have Iroquois women with real political authority. On the right, colonial women with no legal identity apart from their husbands. The founders saw both of these models right in front of them, and they made a choice. And you have to understand, this was not an oversight. The whole issue of women's rights was being actively debated. In 1776, Abigail Adams famously wrote to her husband John, pleading with him to remember the ladies in the new code of laws. She was arguing directly against the unlimited power husbands held. And John Adams's reply? It's chillingly clear. He just laughs it off. He writes back, "We know better than to repeal our masculine system." So again, this wasn't an accident. It was a conscious decision to reject the model of equality they saw, and instead to codify a patriarchal system into law.
So what we're left with is this incredibly complex legacy. A tale of two constitutions, one that inspired a revolution in governance, and another built by deliberately ignoring its most revolutionary ideas about equality.
I mean, the blueprint they borrowed is crystal clear. Federalism, separation of powers, personal freedoms, check, check, check. But what they rejected is just as clear. Women's authority and a system where power passed through the female line. Nope.
Look, the founders were inspired innovators, for sure, but they were also products of their time. They saw a fully realized democracy, took the parts that suited their worldview, and just left the rest, creating a republic on what was really a half-complete foundation. And all this leaves us with a really provocative question, doesn't it? They had a working model for freedom and for gender equality right there in front of them. What might have been different for the nation and for the world if they had adopted the whole blueprint? That's something to think about.